Well, we got to keep this between me and you, okay? Don't go telling people I said this. This is our secret. But I believe pretty firmly that people who come to 9 a.m. on this Sunday are the best Christians in the whole world. So, now don't go telling the 9 a.m. people you know that are coming to 11 today that I said that. This is between us. But I am impressed. I don't know that I was very impressed with how many people were here when the first song started at 9 o'clock. But that's a whole nother story. That's a whole nother story. I'm going to tell some stories about a couple of people that I've pastored in my life, but I want to give this little, I want to say this as well. None of these people go to this church or have ever gone to this church or have ever even lived in Maryland, maybe never even been to Maryland. Okay, so just so you know, don't go looking on Google or wondering if it's the person in the row next to you that I'm talking about. These are people from churches in the past, okay? That's my little aside. But I've pastored some people with some stories. In my time, I have pastored prostitutes before. I've pastored drug addicts. Yeah. I've pastored drug addicts before. I've pastored drug addicts who prostituted themselves for drugs rather than money. I've pastored stalkers before. I've pastored cheaters, cheating on financial things, on spouses, you name it. I've pastored people who slept around a lot. I've even pastored a murderer, been to his trial and conviction. His story was basically he had been an educator and started selling drugs out of the school that he was in. He got arrested, got clean, and started serving in our Celebrate Recovery ministry. And after years and years and years of being clean, he started having dreams at night about killing drug dealers because drug dealers were destroying society. And these dreams kept getting more and more and more intense. And he started telling people around it, and everyone told him, you've got to fix this. You cannot keep dreaming like that. You've got to talk to someone. This is not okay. But the dreams kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And then he started telling people that he was thinking about following through with his dreams. And people would say, no matter how bad drug dealers are, you cannot take justice into your own hands. And after decades of being clean, he woke up one day overwhelmed with anger at drug dealers and took the amount of drugs he used to take when he was an addict and went on a killing spree through the town that I was in. He started at a home for the deaf and stabbed multiple people, got in his car, ran people over, and when it was all done, he had killed multiple people, none of which were drug dealers. Prostitutes, drug addicts, murderers, cheaters. I mean, let's be honest. This is the list, right? If I were to ask you the question, what are the worst sins you could think of? This would be a pretty good, solid list, right? These would be the sort of things you would write down. But you know what all these people had in common? Again, I knew them all. I talked to them in my office. I saw them in jail. I went to their trials. You know what they all had in common? None of them needed to be convinced that they were a sinner. Not one of them. So the worst that you could possibly think of, the biggest societal ills, the biggest faux pas in American culture, some of the worst things talked about in the scriptures, not one of them needed convincing that they were a sinner. Part of the reason I think this is the case is because it is not my job as a pastor, and it is certainly not your job as a Christian to convince people that they're sinners. In John chapter 16, verse 8, we're literally told by Jesus that the Holy Spirit is going to come, and it's the Spirit that will convince the world of their sin. The Spirit does the work of convincing people of sin. And one of the things I want to wrestle with today is the fact, you might want to sit down for this one, take a deep breath. You are not the Holy Spirit. Now, that may seem obvious, but I think we Christians struggle with this sometimes. We don't want to be the Spirit, but sometimes we want to do the work of the Spirit, telling people that they're sinners. Let them know how sinful they are. But my experience has been, not universally, but nearly universally, is that people who are caught in sin know that they're sinners. They don't need the help of good Christian people to help them understand that they're lost, that they're struggling, that something isn't right, that they're making poor decisions or selfish decisions or even violent decisions. They don't need help articulating how bad they are. They have a sense for that. And so today, I want to read a story of someone who was caught in sin and brought to Jesus. The story is pretty famous. I imagine you might know it, but if not, I hope you hear it for the first time with joy and gladness for the way that Jesus acts. The story is found in John, starts with the last verse in chapter 7, 53, and it goes through chapter 8, verse 11. I'm going to invite you, if you would, to stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord today. John chapter 7:53 through 8:11. Then they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses, we're commanded to stone such a woman. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write in the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. First of all, I want to say there's some problems with this text. Not the story itself, but there are some issues. If you were reading out of your Bible today, if you have like one of those physical copies with pages, there's usually a ribbon to keep your place. I don't know. Maybe you've heard of this before. If you're reading out of it, you might notice that there's some notes above the text that says this was not found in the original manuscripts of John, something to that effect. There's very few people who doubt that Jesus literally did this, but the Gospels had been written and this story was being shared around about something that Jesus had done. If you go all the way to the end of the Gospel of John, it says there's no book in the world that can contain all of the things that Jesus did. And so this story started gaining with such meaning in the early church that someone decided it needed to be preserved as a story of something that Jesus did. So they went looking in the four Gospels for a place to put it, and they decided to take the story and put it here, which just means that John didn't originally write it and didn't originally put it in this. But this doesn't mean that Jesus didn't do it. It just meant that four people wrote four stories about Jesus, and someone wanted this story preserved, so they edited it in right here. So I believe, people believe this fits the story of Jesus, it just doesn't fit the Gospel of John. And so let's just put that out in the front. That probably wasn't written by John, even though it probably was something that Jesus did. But I have a problem with the story as well, the way it's written. You may have this same problem. Actually, I've got two problems with this story, the way that it's written. My first problem is, what do they mean by the fact that she was caught in the act? Who caught her in the act? That's pretty disturbing to think about. The second problem that I have with this text is, last time I checked, to have adultery, there needed to be two people. So where's the dude? Why is there only the woman being brought in front of Jesus? Both of these things are troubling problems. But what we do know because of these problems is that the verdict is guilty. She was caught. There's no way that at the end of this story, they're going to say, oh, no, she was innocent. And because of the fact that she wasn't innocent, because of the fact that she was guilty, the Pharisees knew they could bring her before Jesus and put him in a real pickle, in a real bind. And the reason was because it's clear as day what the Old Testament says needs to be done with someone who's caught in adultery. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10 says this: if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, first of all, notice a woman is caught in adultery, and the key person in this is if a man commits adultery with another man's wife. It's interesting. It's interesting that they don't find the man. But anyways, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. And so there's no room for ambiguity here. And the law also says that one witness could not make someone guilty. In order for someone to be caught, there needed to be at least 2 witnesses. Well, why is this? Well, if I didn't like you and I just went to the judge and says, hey, he's having adultery, and they put you to death, like, how is that fair, right? I could just be lying because I don't like this person. And so the way through this is there had to be more than one. And a whole crowd of scribes and Pharisees have dragged this woman with the law in their one hand and the woman's scruff of her clothes in the other hand, drag her in front of Jesus, and they have got him caught. What is he going to say or do? The law is clear as day. Well, there is a problem with the law, right? You see, the Jews had their own law, but they were occupied by the Romans. And the Romans had their law as well. And the Jewish law and the Roman law did not always jive with each other. In Roman law, you could not just go around killing women because they had an affair. Affairs were still looked down upon, but it wasn't a capital crime where they could be put to death. And so what the Pharisees think they have here is Jesus caught in a trap. Because on the one hand, he either has to follow the law of Moses, which is what he should do as a good Jewish rabbi, or if he decides she shouldn't be killed because he's some easygoing, fluffy fluff guy, he's then a Roman. And so either the Pharisees are going to expose Jesus as a Roman, or they're going to make him do something terrible to this woman, because the ancient law says what they have to do. And so the Pharisees and the scribes, they are sure that they have Jesus trapped. Why? Well, because if you're a Pharisee, what is Jesus known for to you? What are you upset about Jesus? If you're a Pharisee walking around listening to Jesus speak, what is it that ticks you off every single time you have a run-in with him? It's his mercy towards sinners. They are terribly upset about how merciful Jesus is towards sinners, because the Pharisees believe that if sin just stopped, if people would quit sinning, then God would return, the Messiah would come, he would lead the Romans out of town, and the Jews could be left alone again. Everything that was wrong was sinners doing sinful things. They were the reason the world, their government, their country was so messed up. And so the Pharisees wanted to condemn sin left and right because it was the problem. And every time they saw Jesus, Jesus came around and he was aggravatingly merciful towards these sinners that were creating the problems of the day. And so the Pharisees probably don't know exactly what Jesus is going to do, but they're pretty sure he's either going to expose himself as a Roman or finally quit with this nonsensical mercy towards these sinners. As I'm sure you know about Jesus, Jesus never does what's expected. He always finds a different way to expose something else. And so Jesus doesn't speak much in this text. He hardly says anything at all. Most of what we're giving is setting, story, background. And when Jesus does speak, he speaks both towards the situation of the woman who's caught in adultery, and he speaks directly at the Pharisees. The first thing that comes out of Jesus' mouth is, "Whoever is without sin, let them cast the first stone." It's a pretty famous text. Pretty famous saying. You may notice that politicians, when they get caught in a scandal, love this verse. You may notice that CEOs and even pastors and powerful people, they love this verse when they're in trouble. But Jesus doesn't use this to defend himself. He uses this to expose the situation of everyone around. And then what does he do? He says these words and he just lets them land like a bomb. And he turns around and he starts writing in the sand. Most people that I know, when they read this text, what they're desperate to know is, what is Jesus writing in the sand? What is he writing? What is he doing? And I think if that were the point, we probably would be told. The way I think of this more is almost like a middle schooler that you're talking to being on their cell phone rather than looking you in the eye. Yeah, okay, it's kind of flippant. It's kind of disengaged. It's like, let you deal with that. I'm going to go on and do something else. And so he writes in the sand for just a little while. And as he does so, he turns and he looks up after a little bit. And what does he see? Just the woman. The accusers are gone. There's a lot to be said, a lot to be wrestled with here. But I think at the core, we know what's going on. We're so quick. The Pharisees are, but we are as well. We're so quick to point out the sin of others. But we really, really struggle when the time and the moment comes to actually look inside of our own heart as well. We love to accuse other people, but we struggle when the spotlight comes upon us. And so Jesus asks her, has no one condemned you? And she says, no one, sir. And Jesus says, the powerful conclusion, then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. I think it's important to recognize that a life of following Jesus does not mean having Jesus affirm every stray desire that you have. There's no doubt about this, that once she is freed from the penalty of her sin, Jesus says to her, clear as day, stop sinning. I don't think that Jesus is just saying this because there's some sort of cosmic battle of sin going on. I think one of the things that Jesus wants us to know is that our sin has real life consequences. She is having an affair. Jesus is not saying to her, hey, that puts you on the naughty list with God. You could get in trouble with him. He's saying, look what your life of sin has caused you. You're in chaos. You're living a lie. Homes are broken. The life of sin that we live so regularly doesn't just have some sort of my heart is not in the right place effect. Relationships, families, communities are broken when we sin. And Jesus recognizes this. She is going to turn around and go back. The fact of the matter is, he doesn't condemn her, but she still needs to go face her community as someone who's having an affair. People know now. Who knows if she's married? Who knows what the situation of the man that she's with? But people's lives are going to be in tension and broken as a result of this. Jesus doesn't just say to us, go and sin no more so that our heart can be clean. He says to us, go and sin no more because when we sin, we break stuff around us. Go and sin no more. Jesus does not affirm every desire we have. But here's the thing that I really want to talk about today. The thing that I'm really convicted by when I read this text and wrestle with this morning. It seems to me that in my experience with this story, being around the church my entire life, being a pastor now for almost 20 years, my experience with this text is that most Christians I know seem to love go and sin no more far more than they love the neither do I condemn you. When they look at these words that Jesus says, that Christian people, church people, do not want to dwell on neither do I condemn you. This is the point. Jesus is the one in the crowd who could have picked up the stone and fired it. He was the one without sin. He was the one that qualified. He knew what the law of Moses was, and he had no sin in his heart or life. Jesus could have picked up stones and started going to town on her, and he would have been justified by the law. But when I spend time talking to Christians about this, they so quickly want to, sure. But Jesus also says, go and sin no more. I think the power in this text is not to go and sin no more. I think it's important. I think it matters. I think Jesus isn't making a mistake here. But the power in the text is that someone is guilty. There's a clear punishment for their guilt. And Jesus says to that, therefore, neither do I condemn you. That's the powerful moment. The powerful moment is that we deserve so much more than we get for the sin that we commit. That our life can be a mess, that we can make mistakes, we can do terrible things, we can get caught up in horrible acts. I told you those stories at the beginning today about prostitutes, about drug dealers, about murderers. I told you about them. They didn't need convincing of sin. They didn't even need convincing that they needed to stop sinning. What they needed convincing of for their life to change was that the God who created them loved them in spite of their sin, and saw them and looked at them and had a jury put out the case in front of them, and that Jesus himself would look upon them and say, whoa, that's a rap sheet, but I don't condemn you for it. That's what sinners need to hear. Because sinners most often are condemning themselves in their own heart, their own mind on a day-to-day basis. They need to hear Jesus say, I don't condemn you. Because so often, people who are lost in sin are condemned day after day after day by their family, by their friends, by society, but most particularly their own heart. They know it, they struggle, they hurt. And we Christian people tend to pile on, letting them know just how guilty they are. But the radical story of Jesus is that he comes along and he says, first, you're not condemned anymore. I don't condemn you. I'm not going to do the worst of what the law says I can do for you. You're forgiven. You're free. Go. And when you go, sin no more. The emphasis of the story is that Jesus doesn't condemn. They're free. This woman is now free to not sin anymore, when technically, she should not be free at all. But Jesus has made her free. And maybe you come today and you yourself need to hear these words of Jesus. You know, I could tell these stories about the quote-unquote worst sinners that you could think of, people that I've known looked in the eye. But chances are in this room today aren't murderers. Chances are not drug dealers. Chances are not prostitutes. Chances are, who knows what your past is or what your story is. But what a difference would it make in your life today if Jesus came up to you and saw your sin, clear as day, could write it down on a piece of paper, hand it back to you and say, this is what you're guilty of. But what if instead of Jesus saying to you what you deserve because of that, he says, hey, I don't condemn you. What would it mean to you for Jesus to say to you, I know what you've done, I know where you've been, maybe not a prostitute, maybe not a drug dealer, maybe not a murderer, but maybe you have addictions that are crippling. Maybe you're addicted to pornography, or maybe you're addicted to alcohol. Maybe you're addicted to gambling. Maybe you're a liar. Maybe you're a cheater. Maybe you're greedy. Maybe you're a gossip. Maybe you're unkind. Maybe Jesus sees that sin. And Jesus, it doesn't seem to me, ever just approves of our sin. It's not like Jesus is like, yeah, bring me the sinners. I like them. Jesus sees our sin, and he knows it's killing us. He knows it's breaking us. He knows that we're scheming to hide it so other people don't see. And he knows that breaks us away from people and leads us into dark paths in our own life and our own soul. But what would it mean for you today if you were dragged in front of Jesus with your rap sheet, it was handed over to him, and he said, I don't condemn you? What a difference that would make for all of us. But let's take it a step further. Do you know anyone in your life that could desperately use the Jesus of the Scriptures coming in front of them and saying to them, neither do I condemn you? Do you know someone who's lost in sin, who's struggling, who's broken, who's afraid, who's lonely, who's struggling, who's caught in a life of sin that may be obvious and may be breaking them day by day by day? Do you know someone who could desperately use themselves, Jesus showing up in front of them, turning their head towards them and saying, man, I was there when you were created. I've been there through your best and your worst days. I've seen the worst of your acts. I've seen the most terrible things that you have done. But I don't condemn you. Do you know that person? How would their life change? How would their trajectory, their future be changed by a Jesus who looks upon their sin and says, you don't have to be condemned for this? We're just a couple of weeks away from Easter. And what I want to do and invite you to join me in doing is to think about the people in our lives who may or may not be deeply involved in church, maybe used to be involved in church, may have never gone to church, who knows? But someone who could use Jesus. And this isn't to say that the people we're talking about are the quote-unquote worst of sinners. They could just be people who have drifted, but could use Jesus. And it seems to me that Easter is a good time to invite people to church because it's cultural. You know, it amazes me living in Howard County where we've got people from all over the world and we've got all sorts of beliefs and everything is about tolerance of everyone's belief. It amazes me that spring break is still attached to Easter in Howard County. Easter still has some cachet in our society, even if we're post-Christian, even if people don't care about the church. It matters. It lands. Claire and I went to the grocery store yesterday. We went through the Easter aisle already. We found Reese's eggs. Good time of year. It's whole sections for Easter. People know Easter. So it's a good time to invite people to church. You don't have to know all the spiritual laws or the Romans Road or the law. You don't have to know all that stuff. You can just invite people to church, and it can make a huge difference in people's lives. And so as we're heading towards Easter, this is my challenge to you. In the back, you can turn and look around. On the front of the sound booth is the word invite, just written on a sign on the facade of the sound booth. And this next couple of weeks between now and Easter, I'm going to challenge you to think of a name of someone you could invite. Now, here's the thing. I also know that because spring break is attached to Easter, I'm also very aware that some of you will be on vacation and you're not going to be here for Easter. But Easter doesn't have to be the only Sunday you invite people to come with you to church. Did you know that? It's a little trade secret, I know. But Easter can be an easy invite. Do you have anywhere to go for Easter? Would you like to come with me? I like my church. My church is great. You should see the music. The preaching's okay, but the people are nice. You know, you can say all sorts of things. But what I want to challenge you through this next month is to come up with at least one name of someone who you're going to invite. And during this song, and hopefully during all the songs through this series, I'm going to invite you, if you have a name of someone you want to invite, to go back and write their name on the sheet that says invite. Do not make it very obvious. Like, I don't want them to come with you and be like, why is my name and social security number written down right here? I don't understand that. Just go and write their first name. or a code name or something. We're going to take this down before Easter, so it won't be up there on Easter Sunday, so no one's going to be like, oh, my name has been written here. What's that all about? We're going to take it down, but for now, this is just us saying together, we're going to create an invite culture for our Easter this year because we want people to hear the gospel, to hear that Jesus can look upon them and say, you don't have to be condemned for your past. You can be set free. Your story, your trajectory can be different. And we want that to be the culture in which we build as we talk about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus this year. We want people to hear the good news, and you can be a part of that. So as we sing this final song, there are cards back there with a QR code that you can give to someone. You can walk it up. It has our address, has everything they could possibly want to learn and what our Easter is going to be like this year. So it gives you just a tool to invite people. Here's all the information you need. Come join me at Easter, it says. There's also Sharpies back there where you can go back and write the person's name on the wall that you're planning to invite, that God might be telling you to invite. And who knows what kind of revival we could start in our community by us listening to God, trusting that God has a work in people's lives, and that our part of it is just being an inviter. And then let the Spirit do the work. The thing about us not having to convince the world of sin that the Spirit does this is that we just join with what the Spirit does. We're not in charge. We're not the mover and shaker. The responsibility is not on us. We just respond to what the Spirit says and let the Spirit do the work. So as we sing this final song, and I'm going to invite you to stand at this time as we sing this song. As we sing this final song, I invite you, if there's a name on your heart, someone on your mind, go back and write their name on there. And then through this time, I'm going to invite us, you, all of us, to pray as we walk by this. Pray for strength to invite. Pray for a heart that's open to an invitation. And we're going to join with each other, not only naming these people, but then praying for those people weeks before Easter gets here. So if you have someone in mind, this is the time while we sing this final song. Go and write their name down, and we'll begin praying for them together.